fiction, science fiction. We make no guarantees, however, how long it will remain fiction, fiction, fiction.
All right. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to a new podcast in the Thinkering community of podcasts. This is ExoFathom. I am your host, Nick, and I am here to start this very first podcast on this lovely Friday evening with you guys. Thank you for listening, everyone. A little bit about what this podcast is going to be about for your own education. Wow, I've already screwed it up. For your own education. I basically wanted to start a side project from the main Thinkering podcast. I love working with Jose and Keelan, and I think we have a great thing going on there. But sometimes I like to do a little deep dive into weirder topics that maybe wouldn't fit the Thinkering brand per se, or I only have a very big interest in the topic, so I wanted to create something new and create something that was going to explore some of my more out there interests, whether it's going to be mysteries of secret government projects or the Loch Ness monster, or whether birds are actually surveillance drones. We're going to look into that kind of stuff. And we're doing something a little bit different here. I have a lovely guest with me this evening. She'll probably be a guest reoccurring on these episodes. So please welcome Ayla.
Hello. Glad to be here. I'm super excited for this this first podcast.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And so tonight I wanted to talk about something that initially, when I came across this document, I didn't know what it was going to be about. It seemed very strange. The project name is the Gateway Experience, and it's from the CIA's library, which you can find at cia.gov /library. But it sparked my interest because obviously it's kind of a cool thing to read, released papers and all that stuff, to see what the government has to say about things. But the more I started reading about this report about this project that we will be getting into, the more I realized that it was giving away a lot of mysteries, I thought, to reality and the universe. Now, the way it's narrated is from the perspective of a lieutenant reporting to his superior officer after having engaged in the so-called Project Gateway experience. This experience is basically a transcendental meditation experience coupled with a couple other pseudoscientific methods in an effort to achieve higher states of consciousness. And we know in the past, and possibly currently, our government has been fascinated with ways to enhance the human mind, make a better soldier, create easier conflicts with the with the scientific edge or a psychological edge. And so I've always been really fascinated about their experiments into these types of things, whether it's movies like Men Who Stare at Goats, or real documents like the MK Ultra documents. I've always been really drawn to these types of things, and I thought it would be interesting if we started to make a series out of these documents that have been released to the public. Just go on a little bit of speculation. I'm sure this one
a little bit.
I'm sure this one is going to be pretty interesting because, as I said, it's particularly long. And just a sidebar, we're probably going to have to take this in chunks because it's quite a dense document, but it's always been very interesting to me to see how, in an official capacity, these subjects are kind of broached. And so, without any further ado, and without me burying the lead too much further, Let me get our see here. There we go. So this is from the CIA government library. This is a report that was made on the 9th of June, 1983. It was approved for release. Looks like what is? Oh, should they?
83.
Oh no, that was the in 83.
Oh,
I was trying to read this because they do it the European way. So it's 2003. That would be September 10th, 2003. They do it, biggest little or littlest sort of thing.
do you even remember what was happening in 2003?
I was in high school. No, it would have been the summertime, or I would have just been
It
going
was the
into
summer of
Yeah.
03.
The summer of 03. I'm sure we're listening to Nelly and Linkin Park or something like that.
Oh my goodness, Nelly.
Yeah. You gotta do it. So anyways, I thought we would just jump right into this. Since I have a awesome co-host here who has better reading experience than I do, she's going to take the lead with the reading. Trust me, you're going to thank me in the future if I ever have to do reading on this show, because I have a reading impediment. So Ayla, why don't you start?
Well, don't hype me up too much. All right, so let's just dive into it. We're trying to keep this to an hour just so folks can plan. We're about 6 minutes in, and here we go. So those of you with the screen, read along, but it starts out real basic. You tasked me to provide an assessment of the Gateway experience in terms of its mechanics and ultimate practicality. As I set out to fulfill that task, it soon became clear that in order to assess the validity and practicality of the process, I needed to do enough supporting research and analysis to fully understand how and why the process works. Frankly, sir, that proved to be an extremely involved and difficult business. Initially, based on conversations with a physician who took the Gateway training with me, I had recourse to the biomedical models developed by Itzhak Bentov to obtain information concerning the physical aspects of the process. Then I found it necessary to delve into various sources for information concerning quantum mechanics in order to be able to describe the nature and functioning of human consciousness. I had to be able to construct the nature and functioning of human consciousness. Nope, I reread that twice. Apologies, folks.
No problem.
I had to be able to construct a scientifically valid and reasonably lucid model of how consciousness functions under the influence of the brain hemisphere synchronization technique employed by Gateway. Once this was done, the next step involved recourse to theoretical physics in order to explain the character of the time-space dimension and the means by which expanded consciousness transcends it in achieving Gateway's objectives. Finally, I again found it necessary to use physics to bring the whole phenomenon of out-of-body states into the language of physical science to remove the stigma of its occult connotations and put it in a frame of reference suited to objective assessment.
All right. Well, off the
Meaty.
gate, yeah, that introduction is probably, I would give it a good solid B plus.
Talk about burying the lead.
yeah, no, and they continue to bury the lead, which is why I'm gonna have to do a little bit of housework here to explain things a bit further. But I think it's interesting, to me, it's like it never struck me as a thing that soldiers would be doing so much research into something as kind of, I don't want to see silly, but kind of like
occult
flowery
connotations.
Yeah, it's incredible that they were doing such like very rigorous research on something as silly as binaural beats. But let me not bury the lead here. So he mentions Itzhak Bentov, which is I don't know if he's a scientist or a doctor, biomedical doctor, perhaps.
I like saying his name.
Yeah,
Itzhak Bentov. It's a cool name.
It's pretty good. Very, very old world. But so I wanted to mention that this individual, Itzhak Bentov, was actually a Czechoslovakian-born Israeli-American scientist, inventor, mystic, and author. His many inventions included the steerable cardiac catheter, helped pioneer the biomedical engineering industry. So interesting. I mean, it would seem that he would have some authority in this, and it seems like it's not like, to me, it was when I was reading this, and we're gonna explain a little bit further soon, but when I was reading this and reading, I was like, I was waiting for the guy to be like, yeah, this is all BS. I don't believe it. And I kept reading further into it, and I'm like, he's not saying anything is BS. He's like backing everything up with science. And he uses Itzhak Bentov to explain a lot of the theoretical sciences involved. One more note is that he was an early exponent of what came to be referred to as consciousness studies, and he authored several books on the subject. He also helped create what is known as brain hemisphere synchronization, which is what we heard in the first paragraph there. Brain hemisphere synchronization, or hemisync, is, I don't know if, I mean, Ayla, I know that you have experience with this, but beats.
Binaural beats.
Binaural beats. Yeah.
It's good stuff, actually, if you try it. It kind of just mellows you out.
So binaural beats are basically an auditory phenomenon in which one frequency is pushed out in one earbud, and another frequency, a complementary frequency, is pushed out the other earbud. And the in-between of those frequencies is a result that affects the brain in some people's minds. The more maybe yoga and meditative inclined people would believe that it induces states of relaxation, states of concentration. You can get binaural beats now that are supposedly supposed to simulate drug use. I don't know if I subscribe to any of that kind of stuff, but I will say that, yeah, it sounds a little suspect. I think it would be illegal if it really worked. But
no, officer, I'm just listening to my pods.
Yeah, I'm just real high on beats right now. But yeah, so I mean, I don't know about those claims, but we're going to actually get into some of the more fantastic claims that are purported by this Project Gate program, which utilizes transcendental meditation and the use of binaural beat frequencies in order to stimulate brain function. All right, so let's get back onto it.
Well, and if I may too, I just wanted to call attention. So, Plato, Socrates, the Greek philosophers, one of the things that often captured their imagination was this fight between the body and the mind. And, somehow the mind being this intangible thing that exists was a little bit confusing to them, because so much of what we understand and base our understanding on is our senses and our body. Right. But, as so many people can tell, like, your senses are also fallible. So it's kind of an interesting discussion when you kind of look at these transcendental experiences that are trying to transcend your, like, out of your body, essentially. So I think that's kind of,
it's kind of like looking at an ocean through a straw.
Yeah.
We're really bound to our five senses. We don't really get to see anything outside of that.
Well, and I think well, butterflies, they see colors that we don't see. And I always thought that was no way, Jinx. Hi, Jinx. Or maybe we're having hemispheric synchronization right now.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, let me keep going, because this stuff gets really interesting, and I know it's a little esoteric in paragraph 1, but as we go looking forward, we're going to get a little bit more into the physics that they talk about. They're going to also talk about hypnosis and just examining how that works, if it works. They do talk about transcendental meditation and
the fabric of the universe, the nature of reality. Oh my gosh.
I mean, yeah, and these sound crazy. Again, he puts this in this first paragraph, we want to remove the stigma of its occult connotations. But I would venture to say, we sit here and think we know things, but every fact, every thought is based on something that is 99% true, or just something that hasn't been disproven. So, I think that's, it's kind of part of the whole podcast, is to just suspend all of that kind of truthfulness and just think about this kind of stuff, because it's interesting.
Yeah, allow your thoughts to wander a little bit. And we don't need to be so rigid about our ideas of what could be possible. And that's the point of this whole podcast. It's just kind of, there's so much heavy right now. And I know that I can participate in the heavy sometimes, but I think it's nice to let our brains wander on something that's a little bit more fun. And so, yeah. Well, please.
Oh, yeah, sure thing. All right. So paragraph 2, and you'll see that there on the screen if you're watching online. He continues to say, I began the narrative by briefly profiling the fundamental biomedical factors affecting such related techniques as hypnosis, biofeedback, and transcendental meditation, so that their objectives and mode of functioning could be compared in the reader's mind with the gateway experience as the model of its underlying mechanics were developed. Additionally, that introductory material is useful in supporting the conclusions of this paper. I indicate that at times these unrelated techniques may provide useful entry points to accelerate movement into the gateway experience. I'm just going to move on to paragraph 3 here. Niels Bohr, say that right?
Yep.
The renowned physicist once responded to his son's complaints about the obtuse nature of certain concepts in physics by saying, "You are not thinking, you are merely being logical. The physics of altered human consciousness deals with some conceptualizations that are not easily grasped or visualized exclusively in the context of ordinary, quote, left brain, end quote, linear thinking." So, to borrow Dr. Bohr's mode of expression, parts of this paper will require not only logic, but a touch of right brain intuitive insight to achieve a complete, comfortable grasp of the concepts involved. Nevertheless, once that is done, I am confident that their construction and application will stand up to the test of rational critique.
I think that's pretty interesting.
So just to stop there for a minute.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it? Oh no, I just love it. And I think what's funny, and I don't know if he goes on to say this later, but when he talks about his son's complaints about the obtuse nature of certain concepts in physics, I feel his son 100%. Physics was probably the hardest class I ever took, because so many of the concepts, while they were theoretical, just seemed weird. And how did they know that? Yeah. It just was very interesting. So I think that's a really good place to start, that physics, go back in time, as we were developing and figuring out like gravity and things like that. It's just like, yeah, those leaps in understanding our reality would have been huge back then. But if you were to go from then to now, it would be an even bigger leap to just kind of understanding like how much we don't know, or that we can't feel and touch, but that exists out there.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, take it away.
Oh, okay. We'll keep going. So paragraph 4, paradoxically, having gone to such great lengths to avoid trying to render judgments based on an occult or dogmatic frame of reference, in the end, I found it necessary to return, at least briefly, to the question of the impact of the gateway experience on common belief systems. I did so because although it was essential to avoid attempting to render an assessment in the context of such systems, I felt that it was necessary, after having completed the analysis, to point out that the resulting conclusions do not do any violence to the fundamental mainstream of either Eastern or Western belief systems. Unless that point is clearly established, the danger exists that some people will reject the whole concept of the gateway experience in the mistaken belief that it contradicts and is therefore alien to all that they hold to be right and true. And this last paragraph here says, this study is certainly not designed to be the last word on the subject, but I hope that the validity of its basic structure and of the fundamental concepts upon which it was based will make it a useful guide for other USA INSCOM personnel who are required to take the Gateway training or work with Gateway materials. Signed, Wayne McConnell.
Yeah, and I thought that was pretty interesting, that last little sentence there.
Usain Sakam.
Yeah, well, USA INSCOM is U.S. Army Intelligence Command. I had to look that up.
Yeah, I would have had to too.
Yeah, but I also, it's interesting that they mentioned that there would be personnel that are required to also take this, and I would wonder why.
I mean, you know what immediately came to mind reading this a second time was the monk protests and that iconic image. There's a monk, like, I don't know if there were tanks coming down the street, but this monk sits down, lights himself on fire, and maintains a perfect sitting pose the whole time while he's dying. He burns to his death. Any normal person, myself included, would be screaming like crazy. But I think that kind of demonstrates the power of either commitment, focus, meditation. I don't know. Do you remember that image? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh yeah, the self-emulation. There's still actually people. I think it's still practiced in places like Burma and I'm sorry, No, is it Burma? It is Burma. Sorry, Myanmar is the word. It's still practiced in certain areas. But yeah, I mean, I would assume that we are probably going to get into this a little bit more and through this document. But the idea that mind over matter is an actual thing. I think that perhaps the military has been looking into that concept for quite some time and trying to probably master the idea that you're able to affect matter with your mind, or you're able to do great things with your mind that normally you wouldn't be able to do. So I think that
I swear. Well, I was just going to second that. If I'm feeling a little ragey one day, I notice all my technology devices start to go on the fritz. And I mean, I haven't been able to explain it since. So this might be a good place to start.
I think it's that movie Powder, right?
Powder. Oh my
Powder.
God.
Yeah. Do you have powder
2003 also? I'm sorry. Can we take a moment to explain what Powder is for people who might know? That was a big movie back in the day.
Yes, we have to, right? Because we're old now. And there's young kids
who
haven't seen it.
Yes.
I guess that. Yeah. Well, Powder was a movie from 1993.
It came out in odd 95.
Superpowers.
Is that how they described it?
Yeah. Well, no, I don't know if they described it like that, but that's the way I'm describing it.
Oh, okay. I thought you were on Wiki or something. No, but I mean, essentially, well, why was he an albino? Was that critical to the story, or?
It was obviously critical to the story, Ayla, because that's what gave him his superpowers. You don't know that albinos have superpowers?
So melanin deprives you of superpowers? Yeah, but I'm brown. That means I would have less superpowers by that definition.
No. See, it's the complete lack of melanin that gives you superpowers. So it's just albinos.
Oh. Okay, noted. Well, I don't know. Is there anything else to say about this intro here? Do you think?
No, I think it's good. I think that's probably good enough. Let's try to get into the meat and potatoes of this.
All right, meat and potatoes. But oh wait, it starts with another introduction, so it's a short one. So I'll try to power through the intro and the hypnosis section, but it's very long, so we'll just interrupt me when you want. So here it starts out: the Gateway experience, brain hemisphere synchronization in perspective. Introduction. In order to describe the Monroe Institute technique for achieving altered states of consciousness, aka the gateway experience. Involving brain hemisphere synchronization or hemisync, the most effective way to begin is to briefly profile the basic mechanics which underlay operation of related methods such as hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and biofeedback. It is easiest to effectively describe what gateway is by beginning with a short description of those associated techniques that share common aspects with the gateway experience, but which are nevertheless different. In this way, we can develop a frame of reference at the outset, which will provide useful concepts to explain and understand gateway by comparison as we proceed. So starting next is the hypnosis section. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone and the biomedical engineering models of Itzhak Bentov, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of direct access to the sensory motor cortex and pleasure centers and lower cerebral, the emotional, portions and associated pleasure centers of the right side of the human brain, following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain is the self-cognitive, verbal, and linear reasoning component of the mind. It fulfills the function of screening incoming stimuli by categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage to the right hemisphere of the mind. The right hemisphere, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, nonverbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes to it without question. Now, I don't know, should I stop there? Because I feel like there's a lot of nuance in that paragraph.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, but I don't know. Is there anything you wanted to expound on? Right now, it's to me, it's like there's the two functions of the brain. One, the left side of the brain is meant to, categorize and regulate, and then you have the right side of the brain, which is all about the creative power and the self-pleasure power, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what I thought about this, and I guess just not to bury the lead too much, but down the road, it talks about the left hemisphere passing information to the right brain, which is not questioned. So just to kind of flag that, because it seems to me if one half of the brain is responsible for categorizing everything and the other more open side of the brain kind of plays with it, but cannot change the objects coming in, like the categorical information that's coming in, that creates some sort of a barrier. And so I think it's interesting to just see, like, to what extent that categorical mind prevents the other side of the mind from contemplating beyond itself. Just
Well,
based
yeah,
on language.
I would assume, yeah. And I think we get into it going down into this paragraph. The idea is that you want to circumvent the left brain in order to directly access the right brain. Because apparently the right brain is a little bit of a dummy. And
or a jerk.
Put information into it whenever you want. You circumvent the left brain.
Awful. Well, let's get into it. So it's going to be another long paragraph. Bear with me. It continues. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction to a sophoric semi-sleep state, external stimuli, to include hypnotic suggestions, are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere where they are accepted and acted upon directly. The result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory motor responses requiring involvement of the cortex, and so on. Both the sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as the homunculus, which corresponds to points in the body. There's an exhibit, but it's going to be Exhibit 1 if you want to pull that up while I read the rest of this. It says stimulation of the corresponding area on the cortex causes intermediate response in the associated portion of the body. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb if it reaches the right hemisphere unchallenged and is to the appropriate area of the sensory cortex will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce the feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well-being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion or in the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing the suggested feeling of euphoria. Finally, suggestions such as one that informs the hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to in the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity that is normally held in reserve as a result of left hemisphere selection and control processes. This aspect will become significant in the context of the gateway process when attention is given to examining the way that hypnosis may be used to accelerate progress in the early stages of the gateway experience.
Whew. All right. Well, thank you for reading that.
Oh, yeah.
That was quite a wordy paragraph there, and some of them are much longer than others. But I think it's interesting. And my main takeaway from this paragraph, especially when it has to do with hypnosis, is that I think there must be some sort of understanding that the brain can be hacked in some way, and hacked.
Oh, no doubt.
Apparently in very easy ways and in wide-reaching ways, it would seem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely think it resonates with a lot of classes I've taken in psychology or even just articles I've read. And oddly, the the worst example that comes to mind, it's a Grey's Anatomy episode, but it was a person that had a leg amputation and they had that phantom limb pain. And the physical therapist put a mirror at I don't know, like I guess in between the legs, so it appears like the person has two legs, and that provided immediate pain relief, better than like a pain pill could have done. So, isn't that weird? And so, like the way that the brain processes things, it just was that soothing element to take the pain levels way down.
Well, it just goes to show that even the brain doesn't even need to have proof of something physically existing. If you can visualize it, it is real.
Now that is freaky if you think about it in like different ways that can be manipulated. But yeah, there's philosophers that talk about how you really don't know you're not a brain in a jar somewhere. Because, right, like if you
I'm pretty sure we are.
Oh, gosh. Well, I think the Tesla guy thinks we are. Or maybe in some sort of, what does he call it?
Well, I think we're going to actually see in this paper when we get down the road, ladies and gentlemen, stay tuned for the new episodes coming out because we got a lot more. And I think some of it touches on simulation as well as holographic universe theory, which is just incredibly mind-blowing. And that's why I wanted to bring this paper to the show, is because it's on its surface, it's just a report about a binaural beat program. But it dives into some of the deepest questions that we've had as human beings for a long time and makes some assumptions that, to me, are interesting that they would be in a government report.
Oh, yeah. 100%. Well, and I think, too, this report, one, it starts out by saying, I know how this is going to sound, for lack of a better phrasing. And then it just continues to break up these concepts and, like he said, just for comparative analysis to better understand the gateway experience. But like Nick said, it touches on a lot of information. And, speaking of the simulation, one of the most popular movies, again, back to our heyday, The Matrix, very popular. And I think the graphics were really great, but more so, the storyline really captured audiences. I remember seeing it maybe 5 times, try to get all my friends to see it. And they base a lot of the theory on a book called Simulacre and Simulation or something like that. But I think that'd be a great podcast too, down the road, just to talk a little bit about simulations and brains and vats, and I'll do my research. So I got some good quotes for you for sure.
Oh yeah, that would definitely be pretty cool. The Matrix was a documentary, so
debatable. I hope it's not. It's like cognitive dissonance, or I don't know. What should I continue on to the third paragraph now?
Let's get on to transcendental meditation.
All right. Now, I don't know if you want to pull up the brain images. It's not the best image, but it's referenced in the paragraph we just read. So you can find that yourselves. But while you're looking at that, or if we want to move on to 3, I'll just start diving in. It's on transcendental meditation. And he starts out, on the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense and protracted single mind concentration on the process of drawing energy up the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted to the gray matter in the cerebral cortex on the right side of the brain. As a result, according to Bentov, these waves will stimulate and eventually polarize the cortex in such a way that it will tend to conduct a signal along the homunculus starting from the toes and on up. The Bentov biomedical model, as described in a book by Lee Sanella, MD, entitled Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence, states that the standing acoustical waves are the result of the altered rhythm of heart sounds, which are occasioned by prolonged practice of meditation, and which set up sympathetic vibrations in the walls of the fluid-filled cavities, which comprise the third and lateral ventricles of the brain. In addition, according to Bentov, quote, the states of bliss described by those whose Kundalini Kundalini symptoms have completed the full loop along the hemispheres may be explained as a self-stimulation of the pleasure centers in the brain caused by the circulation of a current along the sensory cortex. Bentov also notes, quote, that most of the described symptoms start on the left side of the brain, means that it is mostly a development occurring in the right hemisphere. Although normally a period of meditation involving intense concentration and practice for 5 years or some is required to, quote, bring up the Kundalini, end quote, Bentov states that the exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 to 7 hertz, cycles per second, for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. Bentov cites as an example repeated riding in a car whose suspension and seat combination produce that range of vibrations, or being exposed for long periods of time to these frequencies caused, for instance, by an air conditioning duct. He also notes that the cumulative effect of these vibrations may be able to trigger a spontaneous physio-kundalini sequence in susceptible people who have a particularly sensitive nervous system. Whew, sorry, that was a hard one to get through.
Thank you for reading that.
You're
now
welcome.
I know why I fall asleep in cars.
Yeah, same. I just can't drive anywhere. Just snooze right to sleep. I thought it was interesting that he brought up the Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence book. I haven't read it, but I do think it's interesting to see those 3 words put together in a title.
Yeah,
if only to say.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's also pretty cool. I mean, in this, so the idea that intense concentration can somehow start to vibrate the fluid in your brain. Like,
yeah,
that to me is in of itself an admission to something that is incredibly profound, because we know that the basis of most matter and actually all matter is vibration and frequency. And so I mean, we have cultures all throughout the world who have used vibration and singing and chanting and all of these types of vibrational rituals in order to not just lift themselves up, to lift up their family members or their village members or whatever. So I think it's really interesting that we have sort of this maybe pseudoscience. I don't know. I'm not really sure about how hard the science is right now, but we have this kind of proof that acoustics and vibration have always meant something much deeper than what we probably have just brushed them off as.
Mhm. Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that frequencies are going to be right up there, for me at least, with physics as just something that I'm fascinated by. And yet I would never, ever claim to say I get this one particular concept because it's all just so. I mean, you can go into theoretical, you can go into quantum physics. You can, I mean, even if you get into quantum physics, some of these same concepts come up, and you can see how there is validity to them in a very closed system. Um, and even Hertz, I mean, sound waves alone, when you just start to kind of break down how a sound wave works, how we hear things, same with light waves, how like the cones and rods in our eyes process light, and then how the brain, you have like these occipital lobes that just process visual cues. I mean, it's amazing, and all of that is done by little like electrical sparks, and then you have brain neurons with big gaps between them, and you have these like neuroceptors that shooting from one side to the other. It's not to get too into it, but I dig it.
Yeah, well, I think it's very cool, and like we didn't. I mean, it without even having to go too far into the weeds, we can understand how sound effects matter physically with the science of cymatics. I'm sure you guys have seen these YouTube videos before, or Facebook videos, or whatever, where they put sand on a sound plate and then turn the
Mhm.
frequencies up. And the higher the frequencies that are turned up, the more complex the sand pattern that the frequencies create.
Mm.
So if you put a sound plate and then you pour some sand onto the sound plate and play a really low vibrational frequency, the ripples of that sand are going to be moved, but they're going to be very, very long. Um, but once you raise the frequencies, you're starting to see the ripples and the patterns take shape. And when you raise the frequencies enough, the sand starts to make geometrical shapes.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so I think that that's an elegant, really beautiful way of demonstrating how, in fact, frequency is tied with matter. Because all we
Mm.
have to think about is that there must be some sort of universal frequency tying all the matter down right now.
Oof.
which
Oof.
would which would
This is
make sense because, right, the idea that religion starts with the voice and word of God, right? And the idea that God spoke, let there be light, and then there was. Well, J.R.R. Tolkien's Silmarillion, the creation myth of his universe was that the gods started playing music together and created the universe. So
I
I
just
think
have to
sound
interrupt to say
creation
I
have
love.
been really, really tied together.
Mhm. Mhm. Sorry to cut you off. I just love that you went from God to the Silmarillion, Tolkien, but it makes sense. I mean, everything that we have now, it's gonna be folded into the mythology of the future, and the Greeks thinking about, what was going on with gods and the afterlife and all that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, to think that it started with sound, even when you get into, like you were saying, the indigenous cultures that might have different practices, many of them use drumming to evoke a certain level or a certain state of mind to pay credence to what's about to happen. And even oming, to some extent, is going to evoke some sort of feeling of calmness in your body somehow.
Oh,
Um,
certainly. Yeah, I definitely agree. Well, that's why, self-affirmations, worked for some people. That's why music is so loved by everybody. That's why we have,
mm,
ecstatic dancing, like there's the idea of sound really is, something that ties us all together, and not to get too far into the weeds, but there was a theory, very unproven and unscientific theory as of yet, that um,
as of yet.
that some certain megalithic structures that were created with large slabs of granite. There's an idea that
Um,
there was perhaps acoustic levitation going on. That perhaps these people who created these megaliths knew how to position a piece of stone against a quarry and then maybe have their entire tribe play a horn at the rock face so that it would bounce off and hit the rock and then acoustically levitate the stone slab. So, I mean, the math is there. It's just that we've never been able to create something like that before. But, it's something fun to think about. That's for sure.
Well, yeah, and it's probably the best answer to the question, if you could travel back to any point in time, where would you go? Say, I want to go see some people levitate rocks with sound.
Or at least see
I
how the
mean,
hell they made them. That's for sure.
well, yeah, but I mean, if that is how they made them, like, just picture that, a bunch of people blowing horns or whatever, and like, I don't, I don't know. I mean, I think that like ancient structures have a lot to teach us. I mean, their placement alone, which again, we're getting in the weeds, but if you start looking at where all the pyramid sites are in the world, it starts to look a little interesting.
Oh yeah, that's a whole nother episode on itself. That's for sure. Why don't we get into biofeedback, and then I think we're going to do one more paragraph, and then we'll probably have to wrap it up for the evening.
All right. Now, biofeedback is a meaty one, so I'll try to get through it. I might stop halfway through just to make Nick say something, so I take a, a sound break. But here we go. Biofeedback, the third consciousness altering methodology, which will be briefly described, is biofeedback. Biofeedback is somewhat unique in that it actually employs the self-cognitive powers of the left hemisphere to gain access to such areas of the right brain as the lower cerebral, motor and sensory cortices and assorted pain or pleasure centers. Instead of suppressing the left hemisphere, as is done in hypnosis, or largely bypassing and ignoring it, as is done in transcendental meditation, biofeedback teaches the left hemisphere first to visualize the desired result and then to recognize the feelings associated with the experience of successful right hemisphere access to the specific lower cerebral cortex pain or pleasure or other areas in the manner needed to produce the desired result.
So visualization, right?
Yeah.
That's basically
Yeah,
what we're talking about right there. I was giving
it's
you a real
true.
break, but I just wanted to
Yeah.
say that, like, the idea that you would train yourself to visualize something so that you accept it as reality in
See the
order to
goal.
actually get that result.
Eye the prize. Vision. Vision boards. Vision boards do it. Yeah. Oh no. I mean, 100%. I think that a number of Disney movies, even to some extent, right? Whenever they have those montage training series sessions or whatever, the person's like, I'm a champ. I'm training like a champ. I'm behaving like a champ. I am a champ. And I think that's a really interesting, yeah. I mean, even the power of I am statements, that's a visualization in of itself. Just, I mean, it's like a verbal visualization in some way, right?
Certainly, yeah. And I think it's really interesting. I mean, look, we have a lot to discuss on this document, but we're getting even little bits of what might be to come, because if, in fact, our brains are in reality is so simple that visualization is all that it requires, then what does that say about the nature of reality itself?
Mm-hmm. I've said it for years. I always thought that, well, okay, first let me take it back. There's a movie that came out, the name escapes me now, but it's those octopod things that they're aliens and they land on the planet and they have a language that we have to break.
With Keanu?
No, it wasn't Keanu. It was Amy Adams and
Oh, yeah.
and
Amy
the
Adams.
hot arrow guy. It's terrible, but it's a great
Is it
movie.
Divergence? No, it's not Divergence.
No, not Divergent.
It's fuck
Well, okay, well, fuck it. But I don't know if yeah, this is not a PG-13 podcast. We're going to say the F word sometimes. But what was cool about the movie is that these aliens were able to time travel, essentially, because their language had no limitations. They had no concept of past. They had no concept. Well, I guess they must have if they're time traveling. But
everything was going on all at once for them. So their language was future, past, and present all wrapped into one. And so they were actually experiencing all of those realities at once.
Yeah, and the movie was so good. I had to watch it a couple times, and I highly recommend it. I'll post a link to what movie I'm actually talking about because I'm too lazy to look it up now. But yeah, language has the ability to embolden us or keep us constrained. And I'll share a personal example. I was on Instagram the other day, and I came across a wheel of emotions, and it had a little circle with 4 slices, and it was like angry, sad, happy, I don't know, something else. But then there was a circle outside of that, and each category, like happy, sad, angry, had subcategories. So you could be angry, you could also be perceived, miffed. I mean, these again, I only know basic emotions, but the circle expands it into so many different types of emotions that once you name exactly how you're feeling, it does have an effect on you to kind of know where you are at in your own understanding of yourself and your experiences and your internal world.
Yeah, well, you know me. I'm very superstitious about that. I always think that words have power. So,
That's true.
anytime Ayla tries to suggest something about my reality, I quickly make sure she doesn't finish that sentence because
It's
I'm
true.
way
I
too
can say
afraid
you seem
to
rather
suggest.
mad right now. Say, well, yeah. Well, if you describe an emotion, I mean, I don't know. I think it has to be a first person thing. I don't know that you can necessarily name other people's internal worlds, but you're right. I mean, like you are superstitious about language, as you should be. And to give a better example, if I say something like, I am having a bad day, that's a negative kind of statement because I've now committed myself to having a bad day.
Yeah,
Um,
you've said it.
mhm. Multiple times. But a bad day becomes a good day the minute you release it. And just in terms of the biofeedback concept, I think that it's interesting because we had cases where people were suppressing a hemispheric side to give the left brain a chance to kind of do its thing, but here they're kind of reversing it and starting with vision and then going towards action. And I mean that translates on so many levels, even from a business level. If you focus on your goal, you're always going to redefine your business plan, right? According to that goal and funneling it. So
Well,
I
I
mean,
I think that there's
sense.
another implication there too. I mean, as I said just previously, if the idea that all it really takes is for you either to hack one of your hemispheres or to, circumvent a hemisphere or to basically utilize a hemisphere in order to visualize reality. As I said, then what is reality at all? I mean, if it's
Hmm.
not our visualization and our perception of it, I don't know if it exists at all. And so I think that you're right when we talk about how words and language have a lot of power to them. I don't think people understand that as impactfully. They understand it as a cliche because that's
Hmm.
what most truisms now are. They are
Hmm.
cliches and we take them for granted.
Hmm.
But I think that we do well to remember that words do in fact have power, and being able to speak something into being may not be as reductive as saying I want an ice cream on my desk right now. Uh,
Hmm.
but the idea that your language every day can start to mount up a reality brick by brick, word by word,
Hmm.
is definitely a real thing.
Hmm. Oh, for sure. I mean, I think, I noticed a big shift in my own life years ago when I stopped thinking, oh, I want this job or this lifestyle or whatever. And instead, I thought more of, I want to be calm. I want to have a relaxed morning. I don't know. It was a weird shift where it was less about where I was physically in this world, and it was more about how I get to show up every day and creating a life that allows me to be the me that I kind of vision for myself. For whatever that's worth, I'll
Yeah, it's
probably
all
change
about
Tuesday,
perspective.
but hmm. Well, let me keep reading just to get through this paragraph because we are almost close to an hour and don't want to keep people too long. But continues to go on. Special self monitoring, special monitoring such as the digital thermometer, are used to inform the left brain when it succeeds in keying the right hemisphere into accessing the appropriate area. Once this is done, the left brain can then repeatedly instruct the right brain to reestablish the pathways involved so as to produce the same external objective measures of success. In this way, the pathways are strengthened and emphasized to such an extent that left brain consciousness is enabled to access appropriate areas in the right brain using a conscious demand mode. For example, if the subject wishes to increase the circulation in the left leg in order to speed up healing, he may concentrate with his left brain on achieving that result while carefully monitoring a digital thermometer connected to the left leg. When the concentrated effort begins to achieve success, the digital thermometer will register an increase in the temperature of the left leg. At that point, the subject can mentally, left brain, associate the sensations experienced with the result achieved and can begin to emphasize by memory recall the same process to cause its strengthening by affirmation and repetition. In this way, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed, the body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results may be achieved. In addition, biofeedback may be used to greatly accelerate achievement of deep meditative states, particularly for beginners who have no experience in meditative techniques and whose progress in that methodology is enhanced through effective visualization and external objective affirmation. Display of the subject's brainwave pattern on a cathode ray tube has proven to be a laboratory validated means by which subjects may quickly learn to place themselves in profoundly relaxed states characterized by the sort of quietude and singularity of mental focus associated with advanced meditation.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Wow.
I can see now why this report was paid for by, who was it, U.S. intelligence or
For
something?
the U.S. Army, yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah, I mean, like
Crazy
that was
stuff, man.
that. I mean, like, and to be honest with you, the idea that this is just some dusty document that's sitting in the archives of the internet is incredible to me, because this idea, especially this paragraph where they talk about physically documenting the changes going through as far as temperature goes, being able to map out temperature like that and actually measure an increase in temperature when a subject is thinking about a certain place in their body, to me proves, at least in some respect, that we have the ability to harness the life force within us, whether you call it chi, whether you call it pranayama, whatever the force, whatever you want to call it. There's an energy source inside of you that can be regulated and honed in order to achieve really, I'd say, I mean, incredible things. This idea that you can actually measure a temperature increase when somebody is focusing on something, that's crazy.
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely does make the mind wander, because they list out the implications, and while some of these can be a little out there, like, can you really think your way out of cancer? Probably not anywhere close to that anytime soon. Maybe, because again, I'm always happy to be disproven, and I always love when science turns around on itself and you find out new things every day.
Right.
But I think that definitely looking at just the body's pleasure centers, not pleasure in the way that you would think of it sexually, but more just like states of calmness or boosting endorphin levels if you're stressed or anxious or depressed or something like that. We've already seen multiple cases where meditation is even encouraged by primary care physicians to help people reduce stress, thereby reducing high blood pressure or easing the effects of diabetes or something like that. That
Well,
last
that
claim might
and
be a little suspect of, but yeah, you
yeah.
know what I mean?
Well,
Like, you're seeing it
that
more.
and the idea that, the idea of happiness and all of these emotions, and we'll probably get into this further in the next episodes, but the emotions themselves and the idea of visualizing, like you said, being at, having happiness or the pleasure centers, the idea of happiness, it is a frequency that vibrates at much higher rate than sadness or anger.
Mm.
And so if you're thinking about the ideas that maybe emotions are just vibrational feedback or some sort of vibrational generation, if you're
Mm.
a happy person and you're in a happy mood, I would have to expect that your entire cellular being is likely vibrating at a higher level,
Mm.
and thus you're able to probably heal faster. You're probably, able to solve problems easier. The idea that mental health is tied with physical health is obviously something that we're all very familiar with. So
Mhm.
this idea that if you are able to reach that point of that pleasure center, like you said, of happiness and making yourself
Mhm.
feel content and whole, you're altering your physiology in order to be able to do things that might be outside of the norm, which then makes me wonder, if this is intrinsically inherent in humans, what does our environment do to stifle it?
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think, getting back to transcendentalism, not just as a meditation, but just the word itself, to transcend. I mean, you think of like God, Plato's cave allegory, right? You're in a cave with limited understanding of something, and you see these shadows of something else, and you put a story to the shadows, and then you emerge from the cave. You find out that your story was completely wrong, and your shadows don't even exist. They are the light scarcity caused by some object in a third dimensional world. And you're just like mind blown.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Well, and we're
yeah,
gonna get into that in paragraph 6, which will be next episode. But
five actually. We didn't make it to five.
no, I think we'll finish off at 5, and then
Oh, okay.
we'll end up doing next episode starting with 6, which gets into the idea of the holographic universe, which I think you guys will really enjoy. But Ayla,
Mhm.
why don't you take us home for the last paragraph?
Oh, sure thing. And before I do, though, just one last quote. I've been saying this a lot lately, and it's Bob Marley, Emancipate Yourself from Mental Slavery. I think culturally, and even from like a class perspective, there's a lot to be said for removing barriers of concept that we might have grown up with. And just speaking from personal experience, I just want to throw that quote out there because I love it. And I love the concept of transcendence. But I'll go into 5, just leaving some ideas for later.
Yeah, good stuff.
So this fifth paragraph is called Gateway and Hemisync. It starts out, now that we have briefly profiled the basic mechanics of the principal techniques for altering or expanding consciousness, which share some of the objectives and or methods employed in the gateway experience, we may proceed to focus on what that technique actually involves. Fundamentally, the gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers. What differentiates the gateway experience from forms of meditation is its use of the hemisync technique, which is defined in a monograph by Monroe Institute trainer Melissa Yeager. She calls it, quote, a state of consciousness defined when the EEG patterns of both hemispheres are simultaneously equal in amplitude and frequency. Although hemisync seems to be rather rare and of only short duration in ordinary human consciousness, Melissa Yeager states that, quote, audio techniques developed by Bob Monroe can induce and sustain hemisync with the Institute's basic Focus 3 tapes, end quote. She also notes that, quote, studies conducted by Elmer and Alice Green at the Menagerie Foundation, I know I butchered that, have
That's okay.
shown that a
It's a pretty
subject with
dangerous
20,
sounding word, so better than you butcher it
yeah,
than pronounce it anywhere close to what it looks like.
and then yeah, the M Foundation have shown that a subject with 20 years of training in Zen meditation could consistently establish hemisync at will, sustaining it for over 15 minutes. Dr. Stuart Twemlow, a psychiatrist and a research associate at the Monroe Institute, reports that, quote, in our studies of the effect of the Monroe tape system on brain waves, we have found that the tapes encourage the focusing of brain energy. It can be measured as with a light bulb in watts into a narrower and narrower frequency band. This focusing of energy is not unlike the yoga concept of one-pointedness, which we may translate in Western terms as a single-mindedness, end quote. Dr. Twemlow goes on to observe that as the individual gets into the tapes beyond focus 3, there is a gradual increase in brainwave size, which is a measure of brain energy or power.
All right.
Phew.
Well, I mean, that's
Good stuff.
so basically, he took about 2.5 pages to get to the subject of this entire research study, which is the idea of the gateway experience, which is a package that you can actually buy. I don't know if it's on the Monroe Institute website, but I know it is on HemiSync. Let's see. You can go to experience.
Look how pleasant that man looks.
I know he looks so happy, doesn't he?
He's HemiSync, man.
Let's see. Oh, here we go. This is it right here, guys. So this little thing right here was important enough for the U.S. government to do research on, and further to have multiple members of the Army take this program. Now, for only $432, you can be a superhero too. It is a little bit pricey. Now, I don't know what's in this package. I think we're going to read more about that in the next episode. But this is what this entire report is on, is this gateway experience. And what it is, I know loosely, is that there's binaural beats involved, there's affirmations involved, there are meditation guides involved. But apparently, from the report that we've just presented you guys, and we will continue to present to you over the next series, this little package here may contain the clues and hints to the fabric of reality as we know it.
And you don't have to be an albino to be magical.
That's right. And you don't have to be powdered to have superpowers.
That's wild. Yes, if you guys have Patreon, you can buy this for us, and we'll test it out for you. Just,
absolutely.
We'll do that.
We'll do that for you guys. But no, even further, what's interesting, and I think maybe we'll try to figure this out. When they were talking in this, so the idea of being able to get into this hemisync, where both of your hemispheres are synchronized and you're basically rising and falling in frequency at the same rate. They talk about the idea that you would, and in the next episode, we're going to get into the next section, which is lamp versus laser. But in number 5, they kind of talk about it, where they say that you're able to concentrate and focus that sort of buzzing between the hemispheres to either create a more widened focus or a more laser focus. And I believe that has to do with the level of the frequencies involved. So maybe perhaps a lower level of frequency would give you a wider amplitude, and then a higher level of frequency would give you much a tighter amplitude, where the brain is just spiking up and down very, very tightly.
You know what I want to see, and this is such a divergence, but the idea of hemisync, to me, it sounds as if you have one side of the brain that's very thought focused, right? Language, to-do lists, linear, all that stuff. So you're trying to quiet that. And then your creative side might be like, oh, that book I've been writing, I have a new idea for a character, or, I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly how that visual brain speaks to us, but a quieting of both sides to achieve this sync. Wouldn't it be interesting to look at people whose corpus callosums have been cut? So these would be like folks that have seizures. They have electrical stimuli that go back and forth across the brain. Some of them had to get the freeway between the two hemispheres cut so that they stopped having seizures. So you have people now who actually operate independent of each side of the brain is its own thing. And this is definitely getting way out there, but I mean, just to show how interesting this information is. And, it's a little bit esoteric, but at the same time, we're starting to get to a point in our technology where we can start to measure some of this stuff. And it's fascinating. It's just fascinating.
Well, it's certainly fascinating. And I think what's really cool, and we hope that you guys will tune into the next episode because we got a lot more to talk about on this. But what's really cool is that, as I said, this whole thing kind of encompasses, and this was in 1980s. So this was going on in the 1980s. Now, the Monroe Institute's been doing that Gateway program since before that. So it's been going on for quite some time. But what I think is really cool about this is how much it just all encompasses everything. And the idea about, syncing both hemispheres of the brain, it makes sense if you're trying to achieve something like they say, single-mindedness, that point of Zen. Zen Buddhists meditate their entire lives just to get a few minutes of this nirvana state where they are able to interdimensionally jump. And yes, I did say interdimensionally. We'll get into that into the next episode, because apparently if you are good enough at hemisync and good enough about entering these states of consciousness, dimensions will no longer be an issue for you. So, maybe along the way, we can all learn how to hemisync ourselves so we can get out of this dimension that it has us in quarantine. Maybe we'll all just go to a better dimension, huh?
Well, or we won't have to use like Facebook chat anymore. We won't need our phones. We'll just be like, hey guys, do you want to join a hemisync chat? Be like, yeah. We'll just all elevate to that dimension and hang out.
Yeah. Definitely. Well, I think
we won't even need to do this podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
Just be out
exactly. Just beam it out of our brains. Well, I think this is going to wrap up the first inaugural episode of ExoFathom. Thank you so much, you guys, for listening. Again, this is a side project within the Thinkering family of podcasts. Join Thinkering tomorrow if you guys are going to be around. We're going to have a podcast with the boys, me and Keelan and Jose. So we're looking forward to that. But thank you again, guys, for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed what we had here. I know that it wasn't as much as we thought. I mean, I had thought we were going to go a few more pages, but it's so dense that it really needs to be broke down and appreciated, and talked about, so that we can really get the real message behind all of this, narrative going on. So please join us. We're going to be doing another one next week. We'll be doing part 2 of this series. It might go into part 3 and part 4. I mean, it's a pretty long document. So we hope you enjoy. Please like and subscribe. Make sure you're visiting thinkering.space to see all of our podcasts. We got more podcasts coming. We got more podcast channels coming. They're all going to be under the Thinkering family. So please, subscribe, like, check us out. And I want to thank my co-host here, Ayla. Thank you very much for reading all of that. I definitely couldn't have gotten through that. I probably would have gotten through the first 2 paragraphs. So thank you for joining me,
done.
Ayla.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. And we hope you have a wonderful evening. Remember to stay out there on the ExoFathom.